Firstly, after all the racket about prices and people being on a bit of a downer, someone in our community has offered a Switch Zelda edition, Tears of the Kingdom, and they want it to go to someone that doesn't currently own a Switch OLED. They have to be in the North America regions, but yeah, that's just really nice of them. You don't have to do a thing special. We'll be announcing the winner on the 18th of April, and it will just be based on comments in the different videos and chats. We'll let you know that one in a community post. All Patched Up is a series that's run for a while on the channel, looking at Switch 1 performance in games, so it's quite nice to be looking ahead to Switch 2. What does that actually tell us about its performance? What is it going to be able to run? And also, the changes to memory architecture haven't really been spoken about a great deal. What does that mean for the types of games we're going to see? Let's find out. When I saw Elden Ring, I was surprised by the visual quality, but with Nvidia claiming the use of Nvidia's DLSS technology, deep learning super sampling, which basically uses AI to upscale, and their claim that the Nintendo Switch 2 actually has 10 times the graphical power of the original Switch. The interesting thing, at least for nerds like me, is that originally we were looking at around about the 3 teraflops region for Switch 2. That's what people thought. Bear in mind that that is when docked, but if Nvidia's claim is 100% accurate, and it is 10 times, and I don't know why they would put that on their website if it wasn't, that would actually place the Nintendo Switch 2 at around about 4 to 5 teraflops when docked. But there is a big caveat here, and that's that the Switch architecture runs at a much lower TDP. That will vary depending on whether you're playing docked mode or handheld, but it is a consideration. And I do want to say, before we just compare that to the other systems, I'm not saying that it's all about GPU teraflops, because there are other factors, the CPU being a major one, memory speeds, but power consumption and TDP that I mentioned at the start, and also memory. Now I do want to add in a little about memory here, because it is quite interesting. When I first saw that we wouldn't be able to use class 10 micro SD cards, I was quite annoyed. I was like, oh, this is really, you know, what's the point of this? But then when you actually look at the specs and speed of a class 10 compared to the new Express format, it becomes a lot more apparent what Nintendo are doing. So the old class 10 format gave you read speeds of around, well, let's say between 100, 120, and write speeds up to about 100 megabytes. This new Express format can go all the way up to essentially a gigabyte per second of read speed, and around 650 to 800 plus megabytes of write speed. Why is that important? Well, modern titles that have these huge world sizes need to be able to stream assets in, and I guess the argument could be made that you need to have that Express card to be able to do that. Now, where that falls down is when you use something like a Steam Deck and you install onto an SD Class 10 card, and you are able to run a lot of these games without issue. The final element to consider then is software optimization having a big impact on the way that the game eventually runs. Now, in terms of teraflops, the other systems we've got are the PS4 Pro is 4.2, the Xbox Series is 4 teraflops, but it is a newer architecture, and the Steam Deck is around 1.6 teraflops. Now, I love my Steam Deck, but it's also worth noting that that is essentially a compatibility layer running on Linux that is very well optimized, but it can't compare to one single system and architecture where the games are designed specifically for it. The good equivalency that's always used is the difference between Android and Apple. Now, Android has historically just used beefier and beefier internal specifications, whereas Apple have much lower specs, but because they have a single or only very few device ecosystem, applications made for them tend to run much better. Now, there's much more to it than that, the way the operating systems themselves direct resources, but the analogy is a reasonably solid one when comparing these two things. All that's to say that if the Switch indeed has, let's just say, double the power of the Steam Deck when it's docked, when it comes to GPU, well, the Steam Deck does a great job of running a lot of modern titles. Now, it is beginning to struggle. The new Monster Hunter has some issues, but with games that show better optimization, like Cyberpunk, I can't actually believe I'm saying that, and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, they're running well. This bodes very well for the Switch 2. Now, all of this doesn't take into account things like different CPUs across all of these platforms, but what we can surmise is that the Switch 2 is more than powerful enough to run any current gen game, but it may come at the cost of certain things. Let's take Elden Ring for example. Now, the Tarnished Edition is obviously releasing on the Nintendo Switch, which has the base game and Shadows of the Erdtree expansions, as well as new content, but there are visual differences. Early reports seem to suggest that it is running at 1080p and targeting 30 frames per second. There's no mention of whether or not it will include a performance mode like the PS5 and Xbox Series X, but those systems tend to have higher resolutions as well as frame rates when using it. While the frame rate is certainly going to be very noticeably different if you are used to 60 FPS, visually speaking, the DLSS can do a great job of masking many of the changes. In fact, to the average person, when in motion, you would struggle to see the differences between the two games. One element I am curious about is the 120Hz refresh rate in these situations. Having a 120Hz refresh rate is great. It means it can update 120 times every second, as opposed to the standard, which I think is fair to say is 60, but on the Steam Deck OLED is 90. But the hardware behind it has to be able to produce 120 FPS for it to feel that smooth. If you have a screen that's got a set refresh rate, say 120, and the game's fluctuating in performance, you can get things like screen tearing, issues with input latency, especially if you have to forcibly lock the synchronization. But again, that's where Nintendo have thought ahead. We have had G-Sync confirmed, which essentially allows them to adapt the refresh rate. That's called VRR, which is variable refresh rate technology, and it means the console can dynamically adjust its refresh rate to match the frame rate of the content being played, thus making it feel smoother and eradicating any issues like tearing or stuttering. Nvidia have already confirmed that in handheld mode, it's using G-Sync, and for those that haven't used that tech before, you are going to be able to really feel the difference between a G-Sync 30 FPS game running on Switch 2 and potentially the same game running on Switch 1. It will just feel smoother. Tears of the Kingdom then, because we know exactly how that's going to run. Originally we had 30 frames per second, it had dynamic resolution scaling, and it ranged anywhere between 540p and 900p. Some key bottlenecks were the CPU, the memory speed, and there were a few areas where you would see significant performance hits. In the recent Nintendo Treehouse, we got to see the game running at its full 4K resolution at 60 FPS. Now here's an interesting point of note. Again, if we just take theoretical numbers and we try to run it at that resolution without DLSS or any type of upscaling, it would need about 7 to 10 teraflops of power dependent on optimization, which would put it around about the equivalent to a PS5 or RTX 2080, essentially out of the ballpark of what we know the Switch 2 has. However, if we use the DLSS 2.0 layer or equivalent, which then renders the game at 1080p or 1440, the upscaling to 4K would use between 4 and 5 teraflops, which, as we all know, is the Switch 2's rumored power. For comparison, if you're trying to do that running on an emulator, you need a much beefier system. This also ties in nicely with handheld mode. We know the screen is 1080p, and at 60 frames per second, that would roughly put the performance requirement at around 1.7 to 1.8 teraflops. Again, if we assume DLSS is being used, meaning that the real resolution may actually be below 1080p and it's upscaling it. And before we start to panic, this isn't something new to current gen. Both Xbox Series X and PS5 have used upscaling technologies to produce their 4K, 60 and even 120 FPS images. That's really one of the key differences with PC gaming. If you've got a high enough end card, you can run everything natively without any upscaling at all, which will invariably produce a clearer image. But the difference is when you're looking at it in motion can be quite negligible. Cyberpunk is still very much in development for Switch, even though we saw it running. There are indications from the team that the build that we saw was quite an early one. With that in mind though, they do cite a performance of 40 frames per second, and I think it was Digital Foundry commented on the game potentially running at 1080p, or at least up to 1080p, and then I think the handheld was between 540 and 720. I think the 40 frames per second target refers to a performance mode, whereas quality would aim for 30. This version comes with all of the expanded content as well, the DLC content that didn't actually release on the lower end system, so it is a nice indication that the Switch 2 is potentially a little more powerful than we were led to believe. Now with that said, performance stutters can be seen in the footage we saw. While it targets 30 frames per second, there are a few drops and hitches But you cannot take frame rates from this type of footage. When we do frame rate capture, the software we use, it needs a raw video format. So it needs to be raw video capture. If you try and run a stream's video through it, it will give you a result, but it's very inaccurate. I think the software Digital Foundry use probably has some wizardry in it, but for everyone else, we're gonna need to wait until we get the actual game in hands. Props to CD Projekt Red for actually putting the whole thing on a 64GB cartridge. They did the same thing, didn't they, with The Witcher? And in a world where physical games seem to be diminishing, it's just good to see. Now, the game I was most excited to see potentially was the Elden Ring re-release. We've already had a few channels do side-by-side comparisons. Here is a really good example. I'll pop a link to this as well in the description. But it goes back to what I was saying before, as when you see a game in motion, side by side, those differences are actually much smaller than at first they may appear. With that said, you can see some drop in texture quality. Perhaps aliasing is worse. I think for most it's going to be good enough though, and if you've not played it before, on Steam Deck it was able to run reasonably well at 30 frames per second, and you could push it a little further if you tweaked certain things, and it was good enough. Sadly though, From Software haven't gone the same route as CD Projekt Red when it comes to how the game is actually packaged physically. This could be wrong, but from what I understand, they might be using that game keycard system where you get the, I don't know what you'd even call it, the little key card you put into your Switch and then it downloads the game. People weren't very happy with this. I'm not sure. I think it might be a way for, at least for Nintendo, to allow you to resell games that have a digital download only aspect to them. But I would have much preferred to see the whole thing, you know, actually on the cartridge or on a cartridge. Now, from what I saw so far, I haven't seen the use of real-time ray tracing that Nintendo spoke about, and Nvidia also confirmed the chipset is capable of. I wonder if that means that it's something that we won't see a great deal of. But it gives some idea of limitations as far as performance overheads that they're working with. But we'll leave it there for this one. It's turned into a much bigger episode than I thought it would. I'm sure in the very near future we'll be going hands-on and we'll be able to give you a little bit more about the current Switch 2 situations and how it actually feels in the hand. Still, a thanks to all of you that enjoy the content. Remember, we are giving away actually that Nintendo Switch Zelda edition. If you want to be in that, just leave comments down below. We'll be picking someone. I think it was the 18th of April we set as the end date. You don't have to do anything special. You don't have to try and impress us. If you don't own a Switch OLED, that is the only criteria. So I know that's going to be a lot of you out of the running, and you could potentially be dishonest and say that you do. Oh, and it's US only as well. Thanks to all of you that enjoy the content. For all things Switch all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya!